19. That's the nothing personal word of the day. And it's a Samson sit down with Mike Ryan, who has been with Dan Le Batard for 19 years. And I am so happy to be part of Meadowlark and happy, Mike, that you took the time to sit down with me today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for the invite. I'm excited to take part in one of these.
It's fantastic. It's first of all, the audience loves to hear from you and they love to get an idea of what happens behind the scenes. Some people will be shocked to know that we would take the time to speak on the phone, either in front of people or not, but we actually do. And I don't have all the time in the world, so I just want to start. Can we talk about Meadowlark Media and the change that you made in the start of Meadowlark Media and what's happened since then? And how you feel about the change that's happened in your life, because it's pretty significant.
Wow, this is a lot of different questions balled into one.
Yes, it is. It's like we're on the phone. Let's go with an easy one.
Yeah.
Tell me how you're doing at Meadowlark.
How am I doing right now, presently?
Right this second.
Yeah, I'm doing well. I think the creative in me is reconciling with the fact that, as you know, when you focus on business development, some of these are longer plays. You don't necessarily have as many things to show for all your hard work. A lot of these things are months long, sometimes years long in development. And I really wish for my own sake, and I really wish for some people maybe in our audience that are a little confused why I decided to step aside, that I had something immediately to show for it. I think the last time I stepped aside, I was simultaneously, as my time was coming to an end, as we were pivoting to Chris Whittingham, I was working on that musical, and it was kind of like a literal opus that people could kind of see where my mind was geared. And this time I stepped aside, a lot like, well, I'm not directly comparing myself to Tom Brady, but you know, when Tom Brady stepped aside for the first time,
are you indirectly comparing yourself?
Yeah, I'm indirectly, because Tom Brady stepped away for the first time and it was a bigger thing. And the second time he just decided, I'm just going to post a selfie video from the beach and you're going to have to believe me whether or not I'm actually gone. And the second time I stepped aside, I was still kind of around, especially the first couple of weeks. I was still back in the seat, so I was a little confused by it. But to answer your question in a more concise manner, I'm really doing well. I just wish that I had something to hold up that was tangible to people so they could also see that I'm doing well.
But are you thinking that the audience is judging your well-being based on the output that they can see, feel, touch, and smell? Is that why you feel like you have to deliver something to them to let them know, hey, I'm good?
This might already turn into a therapy session. I probably feel like I need to present something to satiate my own ego, because I am a grinder. I like to immerse myself in work, and I really like to immerse myself in the creative process. And sometimes that's very self-evident when I'm producing a show and I have a musical to show for it. A lot of these other projects, not just within Meadowlark, but personally, I've also expanded my portfolio and I've expanded my interests, and I have a couple of other really exciting things that I'm working on to satiate some of the creativity that is left on the table by stepping aside for the team over at DLS.
You're working on things for Meadowlark or for yourself?
Both.
So what kind of, so for Meadowlark, because it's a little clumsy, and that's the beauty of Dan's show, is that what's a bit, what's not a bit. I probably, Mikey, I probably get asked that more than any other question other than why do you suck at Survivor is the Le Batard show real? That is a question that I'm asked sort of out and about. And the way in which you were an EP and then you were gone, Whitty was there, then gone, and then you're back, and then you gone, and now Dan makes jokes of who is doing it, who's not. Is that a bit or not? Or are you really not the EP anymore?
I'm really not the EP anymore, and I'm trusting the process that we have. I'm still around if people want to pick my brain. I have my own private frustrations occasionally. Luckily for me, I'm not biting on a rope, feeling tortured watching DLS grow. I think it was very much the time for a new voice to get involved and for a new direction. I'm very cognizant that we've been around for 20 years, and The show has reinvented itself, as I've learned, because I'm really, one of the things I'm spearheading in my time away from the EP role is really immersing myself in the show's history for the first time ever, really trying to get a concrete timeline of the last 20 years for some projects that we'll announce in the coming months. But I am not EP. I am very much a part of the show, occasionally as talent. The part that it's hardest for me, honestly, David, is when I'm in that back row and some of the technical aspects, some of the minutia that people don't pick up on, some of the communication issues that may pop up. There are times that I just want to get back in my old chair and smooth things out, but I realize I need to give myself over to the process. But to answer your initial question about, is the Le Batard show real? And I've become familiar with the John Wick universe recently.
Coca's favorite universe, side
note. And the John Wick universe, as Coca knows, exists in kind of a pushed reality. And I would say the Le Batard show is also a pushed reality. A lot of the real life problems often bubble to the surface. A lot of the times we have real life issues or real life things going on that are discovered on the show, and you have to find a way to work that stuff out that may actually irk you. You have to remember that some of the best content also comes from the connections, the true organic connections that people have with those characters, and they have to believe. But it also puts me in a bit of an uncomfortable spot because people assume that my character on that show is who I am in real life. I'm not saying they're not.
People could say that.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they're not similar, but again, it's a very hyper pushed version of myself. There are some things that are bit. There are some things that I'm not comfortable sharing with the audience. There are some things that maybe my family wish I wasn't so comfortable. But all of it is like the best wrestling characters. Who you are, but just amplified for the audience.
I resemble that comment. I would tell you that for a former manager to become a bench coach is a really hard adjustment, and a lot of managers cannot do it. Or for a fired GM to become a pro scout, because they know how to operate it. They've operated it before. And to be so close to the operation, but to not want to step on the current operator, that is a very difficult role. Did you take to that immediately, or do you fight it when you're in the back row, as you said? How hard is it for you to see something happen that could be better and not say anything?
It hasn't become easier, but I don't want to undercut teammates. And to be honest, I've seen pretty tremendous growth, as you would expect from people just thrusted into these positions, because it's not just Chris Cody, who's the obvious one to the eye. A lot of people are doing different things behind the scenes and creatively as a part of our overall production, because I stepped aside. All the things that lived in my head now have to be written out, have to be assigned to people. So I think everyone, including most of all, probably Dan, who was very comfortable with me in that other chair, everyone's going through an adjustment right now. I actually think we're navigating it pretty well, because we've had some big changes to the energy of the show, personnel moves, different studios. Again, all this stuff is very fresh in my mind because I've been very hard at work at establishing a timeline. And I would say through all the transitions, this one, and I can't speak for the talent on the other side of the glass, this one seems to be going, just in terms of vibes and the content that we're pushing out, the easiest of all the changes, I feel.
So when Dan and I talk, it's funny. He talks to me in similarly to what you're saying, except the difference is this. He's not yet fully there, that thinking the show is better without you in the EP chair. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that from the audience standpoint, from a team standpoint, that sometimes the long-term health, you have to make short-term changes, have short-term pain. And it is interesting that you say that you think there's been no short-term pain at all. And I guess the audience numbers would show it due to the health of Dan's show. But it's something to at least look out for when you're trying to segue to be a bench coach, that sometimes your help is still needed.
Oh, you're putting words in my mouth. I'm not saying that there are no short-term pains here. There are absolutely growing pains, but I don't think it's as big as a transition when I had to fill Hawk's shoes. I really don't. And that took the better part of a decade for me to finally get to a place where Dan was comfortable. I think if we compare that timeline to this timeline and this new challenge for Dan, again, I run the risk of speaking for him. Just from what I'm seeing, just from the vibes, just how everybody's operating, from a resources and support standpoint, so many people have Dan's back. So many people want Dan and Stu to be comfortable in that Air studio. I do think that this is going better than I feared.
So you mentioned 20 years of Dan's show. I think I was trying to think the first time I was on it must have been 03, 02, 03. So there was no show. I don't know what I was doing with Dan back then, but when I got to Florida, I started doing stuff with him almost immediately. What are you going to do? How do you celebrate 20 years? It's changed so much. It's not a local show by any stretch.
I don't want to tip our hands because I spent the last few weeks putting together a treatment for an original content play that will feel big enough to honor a very sordid history for the Dan Le Batard show that I think our diehards will love, quite honestly. And I think the media world has changed, and I do think that we're not as present. I think guys like Pat McAfee, who I admire, and I think he does a great job, I think they're benefiting from the platform that we had. Yeah, we had to find a way. Thankfully, we didn't lose our audio audience. We only built on our audio audience after we left ESPN. But there is a real value in visibility. There is a real value that Pat McAfee has in just being on main ESPN, even if it's on mute. You associate that guy with the biggest game in town. So I want to make sure that I do something that's not just for our diehards, but for maybe people that only made us part of their routine when we were unavoidable. I miss the good old days when people would scan on the radio, and if someone was on commercial, they had to say on you. They were forced to give you a try, and we would do well in those tight windows. Maybe not initially, but over time, we'd eventually get you to stay in the tent that the platforms kind of dictated. We don't have that right now. We make it chucked into your algorithm because something pops on our show. But if you want to avoid us and you consume sports, you can. So for those people that enjoyed our show when it was unavoidable, I want to give them a reason to come back, and also a reason to realize that, hey, we're still a pretty kick-ass show. We're
still making an argument, though, that I'm going to push back on about what's avoidable and what's not. If you speak to people 15 to 25, I believe they would tell you that ESPN is avoidable, and they are consuming content exactly the way you're distributing it, because McAfee does it too. And Patrick and anybody else is doing what you're doing and what we're doing at Meadowlark. So I think you're speaking to a larger issue, which is something that I covered last week. We're all avoidable and replaceable now, and having the platform of ESPN seems sexy. But at the end of the day, for you to achieve the revenue that you achieve as a company, I think that you're worth more today than you were as a show on ESPN.
Well, I certainly believe so too. Otherwise, I wouldn't be dabbling in the business development side too. I'm just outlining some of the challenges. And
you're saying it's a challenge because you think you're not as visible, though.
Yeah, we're not as visible. Okay, well, I do think that we're more visible. Look, there's a lot of shows that I have a lot of respect for that I don't necessarily have the time to listen episode by episode. You're one of those shows. I almost consume you universally through clips. And that's how I really get a good lay of the land. And our show does well there. I do think guys like McAfee, because of the platform that he has, doesn't just have main channel ESPN. He also has a lot of media critics watching main channel ESPN, because while you think 15 to 25-year-olds maybe would argue that ESPN is unavoidable, the people that cover this stuff come from a different era. And also main channel ESPN means that you get to leverage bigger social platforms. What's the biggest social platform right now for the Le Batard show? Its own social channels. We don't have an ESPN chalking us into, well, to be fair, when we were at ESPN wasn't really chalking us into main feed either. But we have YouTube algorithms to grow. We have word of mouth. We have engaging clips that hopefully get people over back into the tent. it's it's a challenge. I've seen through the 20 years or so that I've been in the industry, I've seen it change wildly. And I'd like the challenge of having to try to crack the code every couple of years. And thankfully, over here at Meadowlark, I have faith that I don't have to do it alone. And that's, hand to God, this is the only stage in my career where I have faith that I'm not the one that has to come up with the answers. I don't have to feel the pressure of being the smartest guy in the room. I alone don't have to see the path to what the industry will look like a couple of years from now. We have very bright people, talent, administrators, producers alike that have a good vision about these things. So I'm really relishing in the fact that it's not all on me, because while you could hold up the podcast feed and how I really prioritized that and how I made sure it never went away when it worked against our best interests on terrestrial radio, how I made sure that it came with us to ESPN, how when we were going through our buyout talks over at ESPN, the number one thing with a bullet was we need to maintain our RSS feed, the same one that an intern created on the Dan Le Batard show 19 years ago.
It's the greatest thing you ever did was get your RSS feed from ESPN.
But I'm not going to well, I know that's a victory, and I know it's been huge for the entire company. It's why we're probably here on this Zoom right now, is because we had that. We carried over that customer base. I'm also really kicking myself over not seeing the emergence of digital video, not doing more while we were at ESPN to leverage some of their video channels when they really didn't know what they were doing. Because while we were pioneers in the digital audio space, other guys were pioneering on the digital video space, and we're playing catch up right now. Some of it, I mean, all of it, really, you have to discern. You have to really get in the numbers with time spent watching or time spent listening, recurring subscriptions and whatnot. Some of it can be very phony, and that's another part of this challenge in these days, David, is finding out what's real, like what is a real audience. And I'm just happy I don't have to do it alone.
So it's amazing. You come from a huge company and then you go to a smaller company and you're saying you're less alone right now. I guess that is a statement of the hiring that you all have done and the people around you. But when you're saying you're not alone, part of being a control freak, and I guess I view you that way, and I say that positively, not negatively at all. It's how you've been so successful. Navigating the waters in Bristol versus navigating the waters at Meadowlark, your goals are now different given your positional change. Don't you think that being in control is even more important in your current position than as EP, where you did have Dan or you had Stu or talent around you? Now it's you doing development.
Perhaps in the early days, throughout that pirate phase, making sure that the show just didn't lose any momentum. It is not talked about a lot. It is not sexy. No one really knows what goes into it. But the fact that we were on ESPN for our final show on January 4th, and then we're able to put out a show totally independently from the same studios as our audience kept consuming it on January 5th, like that, there's
insanity.
There's a docu-series just on what those 2 weeks were like, because God bless our co-founders. They are at the very top of their industries. But if you ask them what goes into making sure that we have internet or lights on at the Clevelander, like that all took figuring out. It took figuring out how to record, how to distribute, how to make sure we were on good enough terms with ESPN that we could navigate that transition as best we could. I am so proud of that. And it is not sexy at all. To me, that's probably the toughest thing I've ever done in my career, was make sure that we could at least maintain our audience immediately after we left ESPN. I think that was so key to everything that we were doing, because that's the only time in our show's history that we ever were free agents. We had to maintain our value in an open market. And it's easy to do that when you've got the mothership. I mean, Colin Cowherd left the midday spot. He wasn't toiling around for a couple of months trying to figure out what his next move was. He was on main channel ESPN while he was leveraging that huge audience and that huge platform. We were leveraging our independency. Thank God we had that RSS feed, and we changed up the cadence. We weren't releasing as much, but we found a way to build on that audience and maintain our value in an open market. Thank God.
Those days seem like yesterday to me. What year was that?
That was 2021. That was
January
January 5th.
Of COVID.
Yeah, January 4th was our 2021 was our last show at ESPN. January 5th, 2021 was our first show as Pirates. Do I need to tell you what happened on January 6th that year?
No, but when did you and I do our COVID shows? What year was that?
We did that in 2020 during the lockdown.
So I didn't realize that was pre Meadowlark.
Yeah, that we were on ESPN. We were putting out.
Didn't even realize that.
Yeah, so we were putting out in that summer, ESPN 790 The Ticket, which had combined with QAM, had made the decision that they weren't going to do the local hour anymore. And we didn't get a lot of heads up on that. We collectively made the decision that, look, we have this digital property. We have an audience that still wants this. I see the numbers. I know that the people that consume us over the air on 790 pales in comparison to the people that consume that hour digitally. So we decided we're going to keep this going because we need to keep our audience. By then, the writing was on the wall with Skipper and ESPN parting ways that, look, had the pandemic not happened, we would have been out at ESPN a lot sooner. We just kind of sat on the ball, still doing really good things, invented new ways to broadcast. But while we were putting out content, ESPN was scrambling to get its post-Skipper management team fully in place. And then we left.
It's a good thing my hand's not on the Bible, because I would have said that you and I did our work together when you were at Meadowlark. And I would have believed it.
No, we did.
Time is very strange since the pandemic. I get my years mixed up completely.
Yeah, when we were when Dan and I were in that condo that he rented in Miami Beach, and everyone else was working remotely, you and I were doing the shows. We had the Ariel Hawani Montreal Expos. I'm really proud of the pandemic shows that we did. Yeah, we were at ESPN. That stuff was going out exclusively on digital, I believe, at the time. It wasn't going over the air. We would record it and we'd push it out digitally over at ESPN.
I'm thinking a lot about Miami. I moved back to New York after, just in 2000, during the pandemic. And I think about Dan's show, and I think about the road that it's traveled. And tell me about local hour, local audience versus the desire to grow and get a national audience. Because one thing I'm sensitive to is that when I'm doing nothing personals around the country on the tour, or when I speak to people or hear from them, they're not as interested in the Marlins as I am, and in my history as president of the Marlins. And sometimes the comments on your show, on the Le Batard show, when you guys are all over me, many of your fans don't care about that. Mm-hmm. My last life. How do you balance your Miami-centered show versus your desire to grow?
Miami's always going to matter to us. It's always going to matter to Dan. It matters to Dan more than it matters to anyone in my entire life. And that's been a constant struggle. Dan didn't want to go national, really. Stu and I really had to push that. Dan didn't want to go to middays. Stu and I really, really pushed that. And it almost blew up the show. I think now Dan gets it. Dan also understands the appeal. Like, look, we've been around for 20 years. We know that this show works. We still have that audience to cater to. And what I hear a lot, some people will listen and they're annoyed with the local stuff, but they know that the characters may be even more amplified because there is true conviction about some of the things that they're talking about there. Local hour is also the most personality-driven hour in a show that is not really a sports show. It's a personality show. It is personalities come first. Sports are probably second in what comes and what works with our show. I think sports and comedy are right there, and you can there's a Venn diagram certainly with comedy and personalities in sports, and that is the tie that binds. But I think our personalities show the most in that local hour, and I think that's why people gravitate to it. It was always our most listened to pod. I think a lot of that is because it was always the pod that went out first. And that's how those things go.
Is that how that works?
Yeah, but there was no math to tell us that the nation at large or the world at large was not at all interested in that local hour. So we
See, I think
kept
you've
it.
been covered though. If you think about it, Miami sports. I was having this debate with someone, Miami versus Boston, because of the Patriots and Celtics. Miami's had the most successful run, either one or two, in the entire country for the past 5 years. The Dolphins have been relevant. The Panthers, 2 Stanley Cups in a row. The Heat, what is it, three
Say,
finals in 5 years?
ironically enough, I'd say that the answer is in the state of Florida, but it's not Miami. It's probably Tampa in the last 5 years.
Tampa's had a good run.
Yeah,
The
Tampa
Lightning,
went to
but
3
they have
straight
no.
Stanley Cup finals. They won a Super Bowl. They had the greatest quarterback of all time. Pick them. The state of Florida is most certainly having a moment.
I
No
don't know.
doubt.
You've had LeBron when the minute LeBron made the decision. I'll never forget that.
Dave, that was 11 years. That was 14 years ago.
That's
He
right.
left.
That's
He
your
left
show.
10 years ago. He left 10 years ago.
He left. So that is true. And then you went to the Butler 5 years, which may have been an even more successful.
No, revisionist
no
history.
titles.
No, revisionist history. When we went to like Dion Waiters, we went through Chris Bosh blood clots. We went through a lot of pain and suffering before Jimmy Butler joined, and then they made it back to the finals with Jimmy Butler. But there was like a good 3-4 years there.
But there's no correlation between how Miami sports is doing relevant to the nation versus the interest in a local hour. That's sort of where my head is. That yeah, people will hear about the Panthers now because they're in the Stanley Cup.
Yeah,
if they were out of the play, like no one would care about an offseason move with the Panthers if they weren't playing.
As it pertains to the Panthers, there's probably more Panther talk than there was when the Blackhawks were having their moment in the sun, because that's natural. And I think those criticisms are valid, but we actually don't talk like that much hockey, much to my dismay. I would love to talk hockey more. I also think Los Angeles has, granted they have more teams. I think Los Angeles, the Rams won a Super Bowl. The Lakers won the title in the bubble. They've been relevant because LeBron James has been there. They had the Dodgers, who are the biggest thing in the sport right now.
It's a good one.
Yeah,
they're all top three. I mean, Miami.
USC came back briefly. They had a Heisman Trophy winner. I think Los Angeles has Miami's number there.
Will you give me top five? Miami's a top five sports market for local teams. Even not well. The Marlins made the playoffs last year. Side note, and they've been otherwise not so good. But I think that has. It's hard to really gauge the local hour if none of the teams are relevant. Because they've been relevant.
People come for the misery, especially in our early days. That 1-15 season, I think the show really found its voice when the Dolphins were at their worst. We've had maybe one good season from the Miami Hurricanes in like the 20 years the show's been going on. Good by Miami Hurricane standards. We've had a Final Four run in there, which last year, if you look at it, that's a hell of a year. But it was also 2 8 seeds in the pros that made an improbable run. I don't think it's, as we found out, at least for the Heat, not necessarily something that you could easily recreate. But I think people also tune in to drink our tears, especially when it's Miami football. And Lord knows I've annoyed the audience plenty when it comes to Miami football stuff. But if Miami loses a game, which happens a lot, a big game, which happens all the time, they come to hear the pain in my voice, and I give them the pain in that voice.
Do you play it up? Is that why you play up your whole Marlins hatred and hatred of me?
I don't play up the Marlins
for the audience.
David, I just don't care about the Marlins anymore. Like I've told you, like it is what it is. That ship has sailed. I think honestly, smartphones, a lot of things maybe pushed me away from that sport, but also I don't have any connection. This is players that say on that on that franchise are very transient. They're not there for long. I don't even have a connection point to the laundry. It did percolate a little bit in me when they were doing the throwback Fridays with the old uniforms and stuff. I'm like, hey, I remember that, but I don't really have any connection. I resent
what about
the building.
The sport? So you're not interested in Otani or
I am.
stories?
I am.
Because we talk baseball in Lebanon.
Yeah, I've gotten more into the sport this year. And it's kind of, I don't think Mandela effect is the right way for it, but I'm like, I see in front of my eyes that the game is more appealing to me. because of what they did with the pitch clock and the shifts. And you have some, but it's kind of an outliers, but you have more people hitting for average than just swinging for the fences. At least it feels that way. And then I read a stat that this is the worst cumulative batting average in decades.
Because GMs don't care about batting average. You know who I picked who I chose to win the World Series this year? I predicted
Seattle?
on nothing personal. The Mariners.
The Mariners, yeah. I watch a fair amount of Mariners baseball, and truth be told, when your team makes a deep cup run, and I love playoff hockey, it's just I know I'm a Panther homer, but take the Panthers out of it. There's just nothing like the drama. As you were there for a game where
it was so much fun to win on the road at the Garden. Oh
where,
my God.
Where seasons and blueprint are on the line every time someone skates up the ice. A goal is so massive in the playoffs that one mistake, one giveaway can mean an entire blueprint in that sport. I think the tension is just at an all-time high, and that's what, if you're an adrenaline junkie, I don't know how you don't give this sport a chance. But while the NHL playoffs are going on, and because my baseball team that I'm following right now, which I am following, by the way, I am watching way more baseball in this year alone than I have had in the last.
It's faster.
12 years. 12 years combined.
2.5 hours.
But it's hard to watch the sport. I think there's a lot of competition right now. I am looking forward to July and August where I can really try to discern who's good. But I'm into my fantasy baseball league. I know more players' names. I have a better read on the sport now than I have. So I do think that the changes have done enough to make me not baseball agnostic anymore. Because I was just I didn't care about it. I cared so little that I didn't even want to have discussions about how little I cared. I had that much apathy.
So interesting. You can have that view personally, but professionally, you cannot ever feel that about any of the sports. Or does your personal bias actually get into the rundown?
It gets into the rundown when I shoehorn 90 seconds of NASCAR into the show. It gets in the rundown when I'm wearing a Panthers hat and Dan knows that I care about it, or when I'm working the Messi story and Dan knows I have stuff on that. But it's not like, look, you also, what we do, there's a lot of performative aspects to what it is that we do. If the Dodgers are playing the Houston Astros in a World Series, it's not like I'm not following the game. I'm just not locked in. I maybe have Peaky Blinders on the main screen, but I got an eye on it, and I read stuff to make sure that I can get by. And I also have faith that in my ensemble, there are people there to pick us up. And that's another great thing about having such a large ensemble is I know that if Dan really wants to have a hardcore baseball conversation, he doesn't I don't have to wear the pressure of him coming to me. He can go to guys like Billy. He can go to Chris Cody that care more about the sport, that can speak about it eloquently. You can go to a Jeremy Taché that has covered the Marlins. So I like that about our show. We would have shown our ass time and time again on women's sports. Thank God we had Lucy and Jess, people that actually really followed the sport, to speak to some of our caveman sensibilities, some of our I got to be honest with you. I haven't been on the air for the last couple of days. I have not missed being on the air this week, given the national discourse surrounding the Caitlin Clark thing. And I just want to tell everybody, I think, this is just my opinion, I think it's okay if you don't watch the WNBA. I really,
wait,
I know it's not.
That's your epiphany? It's okay not to watch it?
I think, listen to me, a lot of people are feeling the pressure right now. A lot of people are feeling social pressure. A lot of people are reacting to numbers, knowing that they have to talk about this. Thank God, because I think they do have to talk about it. Thank God I'm in an ensemble cast where people genuinely care about it. I care about women's college hoops. I probably give to women's sports more than anybody on our cast. WNBA, without a team to root for, I'll occasionally tune in. I'm in on the big storylines, but it's okay if you don't watch it. I myself have admitted I don't watch the national pastime all that much. I don't really care about the NBA. So, like, I think that people need to understand that if you just wear it, it's okay. And I think some people are kind of getting in trouble because they feel the pressure to have the same kind of conviction. And we saw that on First Take, where Stephen A pretended to be shocked, and then he went on his own platforms after he formulated an argument that he wanted to believe. He went against Monica McNutt on his own podcast. Like, Stephen A, you don't really watch baseball. You don't watch hockey. When the World Cup comes here in 2 years, I don't know what's going to be going on in midday programming. It's okay. Like, you're an NBA guy. You're an NFL guy. That's what we come to that show for. I do feel frustrations with the overall coverage of sports, and it's why I kind of really focus and have been drawn to these sports on the periphery, in that I'm really exhausted with how sports are being covered, in that it's essentially just 3 sports. It's pro football, college football, and the NBA. And the cycle, the machine, ESPN has the data to suggest that's what we do. We have the rights for that. Let's just pump up our games and use our cable television shows as propaganda pieces for that. Well, they ignore the fact
of numbers too. Come on, when Dan talks about ESPN, that there's going to be a bump, and you're tempted.
I just did it right now.
So what? I'm not sure what the criticism is, and I got hammered sort of last week talking about Stephen A. and Pat McAfee and how they're dealing with Caitlin Clark and WNBA. I totally agree with what you're saying. However, playing the hits is what they call it at CBS. That's what when baseball would get cut. And when I cover the World Series, this is hilarious. I'm in the studio in Stamford covering the World Series. There was a trade. Christian McCaffrey got traded from to San Francisco, and it was World Series coverage, and they put me off the set. It was breaking news in the middle of a post-game World Series game, and they said, "Listen, you'll be back when we're done, but this is going to be 40 minutes of live coverage of McCaffrey." And I lost my mind. And they said, "We play the hits."
It's the biggest thing in the world. And I think that those, the biggest thing in America is pro football. But I do think that everybody falls victim to seeing the numbers, and the numbers more so scare them away from trying something new. And I think we've seen just with the hockey numbers are the best since 1996. What main channel exposure, what that can do for the NHL. Pat McAfee talks about the NHL because Pat McAfee genuinely likes the NHL. Pat McAfee puts on personalities that get you interested. Guys like Spittin' Chicklets over there and the TNT NHL show, they do a great job of getting people in the tent and giving things a chance. And I think the more time that you give something on main channel, the more good personalities you stack against it that can talk about things with conviction while also being entertaining. I think that baseball would have an increase in numbers. Is it a pure
coincidence that McAfee talks hockey and hockey's on ABC? So he's always talked hockey even before he did the ESPN deal?
Yeah.
So he's known as a hockey guy.
Yeah.
I didn't associate him as that.
I think that I understand what you're getting at, and you think that this is a great corporate synergy, and maybe someone's having the big, bold idea to like, hey, let's really force NHL on McAfee.
It happens on SportsCenter when they decide what highlights to play.
From what I know about Pat McAfee and from what I know about ESPN, you are giving ESPN far too much credit, and Pat is going to talk about what Pat wants to talk about. So
the synergies matter, though. So when you talk about who's got rights to what and who wants to be on the big channels, that's a big part of the NBA wanting to be on NBC and Turner not having an over-the-air network. And that's a real thing for a league. We would have meetings in baseball to talk about what channels, the fights we had with Skipper about ESPN versus ESPN2. It would blow your mind what we would sit down and argue with him about. And so I totally agree.
Baseball was in its heyday when they had Baseball Tonight, when they had a really good studio show around that. And then for whatever reason, the decision was made. I imagine someone had numbers that suggested this is not worth our time anymore.
They did not want to do it anymore. So it reverted back to MLB Network.
Right.
Under the ownership of the MLB teams. And as part of ESPN's new deal, it was fewer ancillary hours of programming.
Yeah.
In order to keep the money where the owners wanted. So the owners, and this was the vote we had. Do we want to vote for this deal where we'll get the same distribution, but less exposure? And it was unanimous. Not one of the bullshit unanimous. It was 30-0. We'll take the money.
I think their broadcast partners have failed Major League Baseball, and Major League Baseball has kind of failed its own sport in really not applying pressure for good, engaging shoulder programming to get people educated on what the storylines are. And look, I've seen the ESPN promotional machine work via College Game Day, but I've also seen it work for niche sports. We saw it with Caitlin Clark. When the promotional machine got behind that story, the numbers were insane. I've seen them pull amazing numbers for El Tráfico in MLS because they devoted day parts in their SC programming to explaining this rivalry, the character that is Zlatan Ibrahimovic. Now, these aren't like, I'm not talking about 5 million viewers or anything, but compared to what they would usually do, there is enough
10x.
Yeah, there's enough proof in the pudding that suggests if you put out engaging shoulder programming, some good studio content, some really good personalities to talk about this sport in eloquent, intelligent, and entertaining ways, that it helps the sport. And the league's got to realize that too. And I do think Adam Silver has realized that. And I say that as TNT finds itself on the chopping block right now. But he has been trying to replicate that Turner formula over at ESPN for as long as he's been in office, because he knows the numbers bear out.
Do you like breaking news? Do you like personally breaking news? I was thinking about your role with Messi in Inter Miami. That was a character that you had not played before, and you play a bunch of different characters. Did you like that one?
I played that character once before, honestly, with Mario Cristobal too. I broke the Mario Cristobal story. And the reason why the only time I really ever venture into that, you just mentioned, Messi, and I lifted up Mario Cristobal. If you remember what was going around, the conjecture around those two stories, there was a lot of misinformation. Fabrizio Romano reported shortly after the World Cup that a deal with PSG was in place, and they haven't decided on the full terms, but it's pretty much a done deal. No, that was misinformation. I was saying, hey, for the months and years leading up to that, they've certainly had conversations about this, but I knew for a fact there was Inter Miami people at that World Cup final too. While he was touting PSG was over there, I knew for a fact he was discounting the Inter Miami story because I knew for a fact he did not have sources over in MLS. That's not the way that he operated. And the same thing with Mario Cristobal. I only got involved because there were a lot of people that were operating in bad faith around the University of Miami that I felt were working against the best interest of the program. And that stuff was making its way to the national news stream because that's the way people love the anti-Miami sentiment nationally. So the only times I've ever really gotten involved in breaking news is because I feel like there is a wrong that needs to be righted. There is misinformation out there.
Makes you sound like a superhero.
Yeah, I'm whatever Gotham needs me to be, David. Right. I'm whatever Gotham needs me to be. And then once I find traction there and people realize that I'm not fucking around, then I'll continue the story because people realize that I'm an authority on this. I know a lot of things. I don't go to the air with them because I don't like playing reporting. I was very stressed out doing the Mario Cristobal thing. Less so with Messi because I knew I had that one locked up. But it's not a fun life. Breaking news is not fun.
Do you think that Messi has had the impact that everyone thought he would have? Certainly on the valuation of Inter Miami, I believe he has, though I don't know that Jorge Mas is selling anytime soon. I'm just wondering, MLS had that moment when Messi came. A lot of excitement. There's still, when he doesn't go to Vancouver, it's newsworthy, and when he plays. And Miami's, I think they're leading the table, but I don't know for sure.
Think about what happened when Messi came over. When did Messi come over last year?
In the middle of, I'm so bad with dates. Was
July.
it in the middle of the summer when nothing was going on?
Nothing was going on. And they had their big Leagues Cup initiative. It was the first year of Liga MX versus MLS. And I do think that, once again, it may not be as hot, but there will be a renewed interest in, hey, let's check out what Messi is doing. To answer your question, I don't necessarily think it's had the full effect that they were hoping for. I don't think we can call that just yet. I know me personally, I got priced out of my season tickets. I'm not so thrilled about that. I see plenty of tickets available on the secondary market. Shout out to Game Time. And I think that there's a lot of playing with numbers right there. I think the largest
Not
thing
by
there's
game time.
no,
Let's
not
be
by
clear.
no, not by game time, by the primary market,
Mm-hmm.
which is set by Inter Miami. When people were touting like, oh, Inter Miami sells out season tickets. As you know, David, you can tout a sellout all you want because you
No.
determine what a sellout is. So I
We
do
can
think
announce
that
anything.
I I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth right now because I just highlighted a part in the sports calendar where MLS really took advantage of with Messi in July, where other things were going on. But I think, relatively speaking, it is an unserious sporting calendar for the MLS, and they have issues that kind of dictate why it needs to be so. Because they're so, the U.S. is a massive country where you might be able to play games in 80-degree weather. There might be sub-zero temperatures in other places. I understand why they decided on this calendar, but I don't think it does the sport any favors because I think it limits their options in terms of abroad and exposure and partnerships that they can have with some of these other leagues over in Europe.
Well, the biggest one was Apple, though. The biggest issue, I think, when we look back on that Apple deal, and I've talked about it, we talked about it in the sporting class with Skipper and Pablo, it's all behind a paywall now.
Stop.
And you may think that hasn't I don't mean you, Mike Ryan. There are people who think, oh, what a brilliant move. I don't know that MLS was mature enough as an entity to make the move that it made when it made it. And I think it's hurt, not helped.
That was my whole concern when Apple came around. I think MLS was doing smart things. They were building at a very reasonable pace. They were focusing on the in-stadium experience. They were building and cultivating a base. And the whole appeal was, this is the cheap sport. This is the affordable sport. This is something that you can watch with your family. And if you're trying to decide what you spend your money on, this is the way to go. And then along with the Messi thing, they decided, like the entire sport in this country has, we're going to make this way more expensive and less accessible. And I think on the precipice of a World Cup, I think they would have been wise as a seed investment to make this sport easier to consume, and then use that launch pad of the World Cup in 2026 to take it to where it probably needed to go.
One of the hardest things that you'll find in your new role in business development, which I'm sure you already know from your experience, is knowing when to expand, knowing when to contract, knowing when to hold them, knowing when to fold them. It's really hard to do when you're running a business. And what Don Garber did at that moment is he thought that was his moment. That was his time to capitalize. And it just was wrong. And it happens. But the question is, how do you unwind it? And it's a long-term deal with Apple. So I don't think they'll be able to unwind it. And frankly, by the time they do, Messi will be gone. And by the way, there's still no stadium in Miami, which we haven't even gotten to.
Oh, they're planning it next year.
They keep saying that. I haven't flown into Miami recently. Is it still not even rebar? Are they still just clearing?
It's leveled. It's leveled. It seems ready for a foundation. And I will say this about the Moss family. They've been doubted a lot over the last few years, both with facilities for their pro sports teams and with being able to be in the conversation for Messi and not just getting him, which they did. And I would say pay attention to the language too. If it can be ready next year, if it's ready for a game next year.
I don't know how. I built a stadium down there. It's really hard to do it in 12 months.
Yeah,
you can never know.
You can have 90% of the home schedule played in Fort Lauderdale, but they're going to try like hell to defy the odds. Freedom to dream, David. It's on the back of their collar.
I don't want to say it can't be done. I just want to say it's not likely that it's going to be done.
Well, I am not in the business of doubting Jorge Mas. I think the last 2 years, he's built up enough credibility to at least say he's defied odds.
He's defied odds with David Beckham. He's defied odds by adding value to the team, just sort of like what you've done. As we're concluding here, thank you again for joining us. But what Dan and you have done with Stu, you've defied the odds by starting this company, Meadowlark, with Skipper, and what you've all accomplished. I'm speaking on behalf of the audience and as a coworker. Can't wait to see what you're going to do next, because clearly everything is extraordinary. So the world seems to have no bound.
I appreciate that. I'm really excited for what this 20th anniversary is going to bring in terms of content opportunities and things that we're working on. There's a lot of really
It's
exciting
coming.
things. Yeah, there's a lot of really
Thank you,
exciting.
Mikey.
There's
Can we
there's
do
a lot
this
of really
again?
exciting things that we're working on that you don't have available for public consumption just yet. But trust me when I say we're really working on some big things.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back. It's just business. This is nothing personal.